much as we can, but I won't go too fast because I know that when I go too fast, I lose people. I'm sorry about that. I'll try not to do that tonight. Before we get into 2 Kings, let's get a running start and talk about where we are in the Bible. So if we talk about themes, book themes, leading up to where we are, the book of Genesis is about what? Beginnings, right? Or promise. We really have the beginnings of the Bible, obviously the beginning of everything, with the beginning of the world. You have the beginning of the human race. You have the promise of God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Exodus is about what? Escape and wandering, right? Wandering through the wilderness. Leviticus? Holiness. Good, or holy. How about Numbers? Leadership. Very good. How about Deuteronomy? Remember Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the second law. Covenant. Yeah, the covenant is reaffirmed by Moses before they enter the land. And then Joshua talks about what? The conquest of the land. They go in, they take over what God has promised to them. Judges is about judgment and salvation. It's two things, right? You have the cycle of judgment and salvation. Ruth, the story of covenant love. 1 Samuel, the monarchy begins. 2 Samuel is about David. If you think of one book that really is about David, it's 2 Samuel. 1 Kings, Solomon, the divided kingdom, and Elijah. And 2 Kings is where we are today. I didn't give you this last week, but I have described 2 Kings as the downfall to exile. It really kind of wraps up by telling us how the kingdoms fall towards exile. And I think most of you know this, but the northern kingdom, Israel, is split from the southern kingdom, Judah. After Solomon's reign, you have Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and they're split, and then the northern kingdom is going to be taken into exile by Assyria. Assyria, by the way, is different than Syria. I just want to make sure there's Syria, which is where Lebanon is, and then Assyria is where Nineveh is. Okay, Assyria is a big global power. And then after they're taken away into Assyrian exile, the southern kingdom years later is taken into Babylonian captivity. And I don't know if we're going to see all that tonight, but we definitely have that in our reading. We'll see what we can get through. Chapter 12 is where we are right now, and we're still talking about some of the kings of Israel and of Judah. We have a king of Israel. Chapter 12 actually have Jehoash. And if you notice in verses 2 and 3, it tells us that Jehoash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. So we actually have a kind of good priest, a kind of good king here. He had a good priest that was helping him. But notice this theme, and we're going to come back to this towards the end. There's this theme that is repeated over and over again throughout this section. And that's verse 2 and 3 here. It says, but the high places were what? The high places were not taken away, verse 3, and the people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So you have obedience, sort of. You always have these high places, and these are shrines. These are places up in the hills where people would go. They were traditional places. And in verse 5, what does Jehoiada want to do? He wants to repair the damages that were done to the temple. And so he decides to repair the temple. But they wanted to collect some money, so they collect the money for repairs. And in verse 6 to 8, anybody who's done a building project let me put it this way, anyone involved in an organization would kind of sympathize with this. Verse 6, it says that after a while, they realized the repairs had not happened. So Jehoash called Jehoiada the priest and said, why have you not repaired the damages to the temple? Now, therefore, do not take any more money from your constituency, but deliver it to the repairs to the damage of the temple. It's like the government. They collected all this money, but they didn't do anything with it. And they collected all the money. He said, look, you're not allowed to collect any more money until you actually repair the temple. So there's some accountability that's brought here. In verses 9 to 16, the people are dealing faithfully in taking this money and paying workmen to do the people. There's oversight in verse 11. There's faithfulness in verse 15. And we see that the details are handled well. And it's actually not obvious from the text here, but I believe that some of this is indicating that up to this point, there had been some problems with the administration of the temple and the repairs of the temple. And in verse 17, if you skip down, we have Hazael is the king of Assyria. This is not Assyria. Remember, I mentioned Assyria versus Syria. Hazael, he fights Gath and he wins, and then he decides that he's going to take on Israel next. And what happens in verse 18 is that Jehoash basically shows his cowardice. What does he do when he's threatened? It says he takes all the sacred things that his fathers, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and Ahaziah had dedicated, and his own sacred things, and all the gold, and he sent them to Hazael. So he basically plundered the area there. He plundered the temple and gave it away. That's actually a theme that's going to continue out throughout here. Then we have Jehoahaz in chapter 13. If you skip there to chapter 13, I guess we could talk about Joash who's killed. He's killed by an uprising. That's in the end of verse 12. It's possible, some people believe the reason they killed him is because of the fact that he had given away so many of the things here. Now, Jehoahaz is of Israel in chapter 13. He's the son of Jehu. It says that he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He followed the sins of Jeroboam. Verse 4, it says that he pled with the Lord to give him a deliverer. You'll notice that and the Lord listened to him, and he saw the oppression, and the Lord gave Israel a deliverer. Nevertheless, they did not depart, verse 6, from the sins of Jeroboam. Now, who was Jeroboam? They keep talking about Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Does anybody remember who Jeroboam was? He's the son of Nebat. Great answer. The first king of the northern kingdom. And what did he do that was so wicked? He made up more places for them to worship, right? And he had golden calves. Yes, sir. You were going to say golden calves? Yeah. And so he presents golden calves as well, and he says, you know, this is where you should be worshiping. Also, he is a probably a wealthy landowner. There's all kinds of things. He's a very powerful man. And so he kind of establishes this bad worship in the northern kingdom, and it's very hard for the people to get out of this. So a lot of the northern kings, it describes them as being unable to repent from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And so that's over and over again in this. As we go to chapter 13, as I mentioned, we have Jehoash II in chapter 13, verses 10 through 13. In verse 11, it tells us he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam. There it is again. And so we just have this repeated over and over again. Elisha, we see him in verse 14 all the way through verse 25. There's a little story here where Jehoash comes to Elisha, and he weeps over him when he realizes that Elisha is going to die. He's very upset about this. We know Elisha because he is the man of God who speaks for God. He was after Elijah, and this is the end of an era, really. He realizes this is bad. And so there's this little story here that's played out where Elijah gives him some prophetic sign acts to act out. Did you read this? I wonder how many of you are familiar with this passage. He says, take some bows and shoot them out the window. Then he takes it and he beats the ground with it. These are things he's doing that are called sign acts or prophetic signs that he's giving him. Let's keep going, and we get to Amaziah of Judah in chapter 14. Amaziah there's a lot of kings here. In case you couldn't keep track of all this, just try to follow along as best we can here. He did, actually, verse 3 tells us he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like his father David. He did everything as his father Joash had did. Look at verse 4 with me. What did he not do? The high places were not taken down. Once again, we have the king who does what's right mostly, but he doesn't actually take down the high places. So he is not a good person. He's not perfect. He's good, but he doesn't do it all the way. He doesn't have complete obedience. It says in verse 3 that he's 25 years old when he became king, and he actually reigned for a long time, reigned for 29 years. And he had the same problem that his fathers had, as I just mentioned. He allowed them to stay up. If you notice verse 5, it happened as soon as the kingdom was established in his hand that he executed the servants who had murdered his father, the king. If you go back to chapter 12, verse 20, it tells us that his father was actually murdered. That's what I just mentioned with Joash or Jehoash. He was killed by his servants. It says in verse 21 that the son of Shomer, his servant, struck him, so he died, and they buried him with his father. So his servants killed him, and it happened in verse 5 of chapter 14 that he kind of he cleared things up. He executed the servants who had murdered his father, the king. It's noted here, though, that he only dealt with those who actually murdered. He didn't actually kill. It would have been acceptable in this culture for him to wipe out their whole family. and to just deal with them all together. But he decided not to do that because of what the Bible tells him. In verse 6, it says, the children of the murderers he did not execute, because Moses gave the law, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. So he's obedient to God there. In verse 8, we have this story here where Amaziah, he challenges Joash to a battle. That's Israel. This is not very smart because Israel, if you can think about it this way, we tend to put a lot of our focus on Judah because Judah was the righteous of the two kingdoms, but Israel was much stronger militarily. Okay, they were much bigger and stronger. So this is really foolish of Amaziah to do this. He wants to fight them because he actually beat Edom. And so there's a story here, hey, who do you think you are? They're saying, why do you think you're doing this? And so Amaziah does not listen to the warnings, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down. In verse 14, what happens to all the things inside the temple? The gold, the silver, the articles were found in the house of the Lord are returned to Samaria. They're gone. Okay. Amaziah his life ended after he discovered a conspiracy to kill him. This is verse 17. He finds out people try to kill him, so he flees to Lachish, and while he's there, they kill him there. And then the next king would be Azariah. As we keep going, we go to the northern kingdom. We flip back and forth. In chapter 14, verse 23, we have the northern king, Jeroboam II. Now, this is like being called Hitler II. Okay, nobody wants to. Why would you be called Jeroboam II? He names himself after the king of Israel here, who is a wicked king, but he again reigns for a very long time. He's a very important king. He was named after the original Jeroboam. You notice here that he reigned for a long time. It says in verse 23 that he reigned 41 years. And this, again, is important because as we move closer to the exile, they reign shorter and shorter periods of time. Let's keep going. We have Azariah, as I mentioned, in chapter 15. He's another good king. He begins his reign at age 16. What is his fault again? Look at verses 3 and 4. What does he do? What does he not do? Why do they not deal with this, right? You think they would deal with this, but they don't. They obey the Lord, but they don't take down the high places. The people are still sacrificing and burning incense at the high places. And it says that in verse 5, because of his partial obedience, or I should say his partial disobedience, what did God do? He made him a leper. So God dealt with him in this way. He was isolated from others, and effectively his son Jotham ruled for a while in his place. Then we have a series of northern kings right in a row here. We have Zechariah of Israel. I want you to look in chapter 15, verse 8. In the 38th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reigned over Israel and Samaria. How long? Okay, you come from a king who reigned for 40 years plus, and now you're reigning for 6 months. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam. And it says that here is a man named Shallum who conspired and killed him, struck him and killed him in front of the people. And he reigned in his place. This is not good. You have Shallum, who's a usurper. Now, how long does Shallum reign? Look at verses 13 through 16. He reigned what? It's almost like the writer is winking at. He reigned a full month. Good for him. He reigned for 1 month. That's not very good if you're a king. If you reign for only 1 month, that's hardly even moving or changing the drapes or anything. You are not a successful king. And so you have Menahem, the son of Gadi. He went up from Tirzah, came to Samaria, and he struck Shallum, and he reigned in his place. So we have then Menahem in verse 17. And how long did he reign? 10 years. Okay, so he's a very wicked man. In fact, it says that he attacked this area called Tifsa. Let's wait before we get there. Look at verse 19. Pul, king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver that his hand might be with him to strengthen the kingdom under his control. And Menahem exacted the money from Israel. Let me explain what's going on here. Politically speaking, you have a large power called Assyria, and what Menahem decides to do is when Pul, or his name is Tiglath-Pileser, it's the same guy, just different name. He comes and Menahem decides to be a pro-Assyrian Israeli government, or government of Israel. So he decides to make Assyria his friend, by giving them lots of money. See, I explain this often, but basically today, things are opposite of the way they used to be. It used to be that if you were a powerful country, what you would do is you'd go around to all these smaller countries and you make them pay taxes to you. Now, big, strong governments go around and they pay money to small governments to bribe them. But it used to be that you would exact taxes from smaller, and you would have them pay taxes to you, and then you would protect them. Those are called vassal countries. And so Menahem decides to do this, and he makes a tax against the people to pay to Assyria. And that's actually not going to be a good idea because it comes back to bite him. It says that he temporarily, this worked temporarily because the king of Assyria left them alone. Where is the section here I was looking at? There it is. I'm sorry, I skipped right over it. In verse 16, it says that he attacked Tifsa, all who were there in his territory, because they did not surrender, therefore he attacked it. Notice his wickedness. It says, all of the women there who were with child he ripped open. So this is not a good guy. This is a bad guy. This is a guy who is very violent. We also have Pekahiah of Israel, starting in verse 23 of chapter 15. Like all the others, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He's conspired against by a man named Pekah, who reigns in his place. Then you have Pekah in chapter 15, verse 27, who actually is a very important king. He reigned for how long? 20 years. So he reigns a little bit longer. He also did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam. That's repeated again. In the days of, I want you to notice this, in the days of Pekah, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and he took Ijon, Abel, Beth, Makkah, Genoa, Kadesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee, all the lands of Naphtali, and he carried them off to Assyria. So we have the beginning of the Assyrian captivity here. And that happens under Pekah's reign. So you notice it didn't last. Their idea to pay off Assyria did not last very long. We're going to skip to Judah for a little while. We'll go back to Jotham in chapter 15, verse 32. Here was another righteous person. He obeyed the Lord. He did all that his father Uzziah had done, but still he did not do something. What did he not do? I wonder. What did he not do? However, the high places were not removed, and the people still sacrificed and burned incense. So he again disobeyed God, did not completely remove all the high places. Then we have Ahaz. And how many of you are familiar with Ahaz? Some of you? Okay. Ahaz is actually a prophet or a king during the reign of Isaiah, or during the ministry of Isaiah the prophet. So he actually shows up in both 2 Kings and in the book of Isaiah. So he's kind of an important person. He actually did not do what was good in the sight of the Lord, and he did something actually very terrible. Found out in verse 3. Look at this. It says, he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Indeed, he made his son pass through the fire. What does it mean when it says he made his son pass through the fire? Yeah, he is sacrificing his son. In the pagan cultures, it was actually typical for someone, it was accepted for someone in leadership to sacrifice their child as a way of appeasing the fertility gods. They thought that by spilling blood on the ground, they would invite prosperity among their crops. It was a very pagan way of thinking, and so he's falling into a pagan worldview here. Very, very bad. And he also not only he tolerated the sacrifices, he also did it. You notice in verse 4, it says that he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So this is not good. In verse 7, he also tries to make an allegiance with the king of Assyria against the Syrian-Israel alliance. So what happens is, remember we talked about Syria. You have Syria, not Assyria. You have Syria and Israel, and they are allied together. And what happens here is Ahaz decides, look at verse 7. He says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get the big cat on the block. I'm going to get the big kingdom and have them fight my battle for you. He said, look, I am your servant. Come up and save me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, and who rise up against me. So Ahaz took all the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house and sent it as a present to the king of Assyria. So you see what's happening. The king of Judah says, I can't handle this by myself. I cannot fight against Israel and Syria, so I'm going to ask for Syria to come in and be my big dog, my ringer. He's going to come in and save me. I'm going to pay him all kinds of money out of the house of the Lord. And he does that. Now, I want you to notice something that happens in verse 10. This might have slipped your attention as you were reading this. It says, King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he saw an altar that was at Damascus. Now, where is Damascus? That's in, anybody know? Syria, right. And King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest a design of the altar and its patterns according to all its workmanship. Should be raising red flags. Then Urijah the priest built the altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus, and that Urijah the priest made it before King Ahaz came back to Damascus. And when the king came back from Damascus, the king saw the altar. The king approached the altar and made offerings on it. So he burnt his burnt offerings and his grain offering, and he poured his drink offering and sprinkled the blood of his peace offering on the altar. Look at verse 15. King Ahaz commanded Urijah the priest, saying, on the great new altar, burn the morning burnt offerings and the evening grain offerings, etc., etc. And what is wrong with this?
The Lord said that that's not how you're supposed to sacrifice.
Do you remember? Yes. Do you remember how God instructed them to build their altars?
Stone is not made by hand.
Yeah, there are two options. One is out of dirt, out of clay, out of ground. The second is out of unhewn stones. And if you want to put in your margin here, Exodus chapter 20, verses 24 and 25. An altar of earth you shall make for me. You shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use a tool on it, you have profaned it. Here's the point. God does not want us contributing. The sacrifice is about our service to God. It's not about us showing off. Okay, this is the point. It's not about us saying, oh, look at my cool altar I made. Everybody come look at my altar. He says the altar is not to be something that is crafted. It's not to be something that is a spectacle of art. It is to be something that is plain, because it's what's on the altar that matters. And here he defies that. His spiritual blindness led him to becoming enticed by the beauty of this pagan altar, and so he has one built for him. That's a major problem. We have Hoshea of Israel, or Hoshea, in chapter 17. He reigns for 9 years. He did evil. He was also a vassal of Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, paying all kinds of taxes to him to make them stay away. And then we have, finally, in chapter 17, verses 4 all the way through verse 41, really the fall of the whole kingdom to Assyria. Remember, the northern kingdom gets taken into exile by Assyria, the southern kingdom by Babylon. And I'm not going to read through all of it, but this is really encapsulates all of the fall here. And God, it really testifies against the people, all the things they did. Remember, the story of 2 Kings is actually really depressing tragedy. It's a tragedy story of all the faults that led them towards destruction, all the spiraling down that led them to exile. Finally, as we come to chapter 18, we have, yes?
Yeah, just a question.
Absolutely.
In verse 33, it says they feared the Lord, yet served their own gods, according to the rituals of the nations from among whom they were.
Okay, so
They feared the Lord, yet.
Okay, so let me explain what that is talking about. What happened is that they were taken away. The they there is not talking about the Jews. Okay, so what happened was, if you read the story, they were taken away. They were taken away by Assyrians into Assyria, and then Assyrians actually repopulated their towns. If you go back to verse 24, it says the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthath, Ava, Hamath, from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and dwelt in its city. What happened then was that they were rebellious. They did not obey the Lord. They did not fear the Lord. They did not do any of the commands of the Lord. And the Lord sent lions among them to torment them. It says that in the following verse. And it killed some of them. And so they sent word back saying, we've got a problem here. Like, there's something strange about these towns. We got to figure out how the people lived here before us, because we're obviously not being obedient to the rules because we're being killed by lions. And so what happens then is the king of Assyria said, okay, send the priests, that's verse 27, whom you brought from there, let them go and dwell there, let him teach the rituals of God. So one of the priests who was carried away went back and taught them. It says, however, every nation continued to make God of its own and put them in the shrines. The men of Babylon, and they all did their own gods, but they still feared the Lord, verse 30. And from every class they appointed for themselves priests who sacrificed for the shrines in the high places. In other words, they recognized this place did not belong to them. They feared the Lord. They were aware of the Lord, but they still did not convert. That's what's being spoken of there. This is not talking about the Jews. That's an interesting little part of the story that plays out. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Sort of, kind of? Yeah, so this is how when the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, line from John chapter 4, when they're talking about the Samaritans, this is how people in Jesus' time who were Samaritans, this is where they came from. You've got a mixture of people. In fact, it says some of the people who were left behind were the poor people, the people who worked the land and people who worked with their hands who weren't very literate or weren't very wealthy. They were left behind, and then they were imported, these people. I mean, a radical cultural upheaval. So that's why the Jews who had this little superiority complex about themselves, they saw these mixed Assyrian Samaritans and looked down upon them. That's a couple thousand years, or not a couple thousand, several hundred years later with Jesus. Okay, as we get to the story, I have about 5 minutes. I want to talk about Hezekiah, because this is Hezekiah is a very good king. He does what's good on the side of the Lord. Look at verse 4, if you would. I want you to look at verse 4. And after all I've been reading, I've been repeating this over and over and over again. Now, somebody read chapter 18, verse 4 for me.
He removed the high places and broke the sacred pillars, cut down the wooden image, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it
Nehushtan, yeah. He broke down, it's like, thank you. Somebody obeyed the Lord. He went and he broke down all the high places and broke down the sacred pillars. And they had even taken something that Moses, remember the serpent in the wilderness that Moses had raised up? And they had taken something that was good and they had started worshiping it instead of worshiping God. This is so typical of people. We turn and start worshiping the creature rather than the creator. We turn things into relics, and that's exactly what they had done here. And it says in verse 5, he trusted the Lord God of Israel so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor who were before him. He held fast to the Lord. You have in this story of Hezekiah, he actually begins to obey. I mean, he begins to turn the kingdom back. He trusts the Lord. There's some international success in verse 7. He actually, he prospered wherever he went. He rebelled against the king of Assyria. He did not serve him. And then we have Sennacherib. Because he's doing this, in chapter 18, verse 13, we have Sennacherib invading Judah. So Assyria tries to come and defeat Judah. Hezekiah, for a while, paid some taxes to try to get out of the siege. So the doors and pillars of the temple were stripped of their gold and given away. And then let's go to chapter 19. We see Hezekiah at the end of chapter 18. Assyria surrounds Hezekiah. This story is actually retold in the book of Isaiah. If you're familiar with Isaiah 36 through 39, this story is recounted again. Hezekiah is in Jerusalem, and they're surrounded by Assyria, a very, very big army, a very dramatic army, a very dramatic siege, and they send a letter of taunt. They're taunting them. And it says that when King Hezekiah heard it, he says he tore his clothes, chapter 19, verse 1. He covered himself with sackcloth and ashes. He went to the house of the Lord, and he prayed to God. He says he took this letter, this is in verse 14. He received the letter from the hand of the messengers, read it, and Hezekiah went to the house of the Lord, spread it out before the Lord. He prayed before the Lord. And he said, go down to verse 19, O Lord, our God, I pray, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are the Lord God, you alone. There is a king of Assyria surrounding them, going to choke them off, going to destroy them, and they have no hope. Hezekiah is known for his prayer. He goes and he prays before God. Do you know that there is a cylinder in the London Museum today, you can go see, which is written by the king of Assyria and his chroniclers, and they describe how they have King Hezekiah cooped up like a caged bird, is how they describe him. But then for some reason, they don't describe what they did to Jerusalem. They don't describe how they took Jerusalem. They just stopped talking about Jerusalem. Because you know what happened? You know, this is what happens with pagan kings, is they don't often reflect on their losses very well. Go to the next, or turn the page for me. If you look at after he prays to God, God does something dramatic and miraculous. Look at verse 35. It came to pass on a certain night that the angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrian 185,000. And the people arose early in the morning, and there were all the corpses, all dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went away and returned home and remained in Nineveh. And the prophecy that was given in chapter 19, verse 7, was that he will go and die in his own place. And then that's exactly what happens. It came to pass, verse 37, as he was worshiping in the temple of Nishrosh, his god, the sons of Adramelech and, Sharezer, struck him down with a sword, and they escaped in the land of Ararat. So prophecy came fulfilled. God rescued them, and Hezekiah, his prayer is answered. Of course, the rest of the story is that his life is extended, again, by his prayer, and then you have the rest of these kings. Manasseh, who's a very bad king. We don't have a lot of time to continue in this. We're basically out of time. But you have the kings who reign, and then they're carried away by Babylon into captivity. That's how the book ends. The book ends on a very sad note with a king who is, in fact, if you go to 2 Kings, very last chapter, you have Jehoiachin, who is this king who's got pity from the king of Babylon, who's brought in, who's fed some food, and he's eating bread before the king, and he doesn't reign, he doesn't rule, he's kind of a pitiful existence. This is a pitiful, sad story of a kingdom that once was strong with King David and King Solomon, now finds itself in ruins because of the destruction of idolatry. So what happens next as you read 1st and 2nd Chronicles is you're going to find a lot of the same stories. But it's a completely different perspective. Instead of finding, I think my title for 2 Kings was Downfall to Exile, I'm calling 1st Chronicles a history of hope. Because Chronicles is set towards expectation and hope. And they tell the same stories often, but they tell you what to expect in the good, probably the positive perspective on a lot of these stories as well. You'll find a lot of similar stories as well. But by the way, the first 4 chapters or so are all genealogies, so do your best to work through that. Those of you who are up to date on your reading, you know what I'm talking about. You're probably through chapter 5. Any questions on any of this stuff? Does that make sense? I know it can be a little dry, but the stories are amazing. I hope you've caught them. Caught the picture. The theme of complete obedience is good. We even missed the story about finding the law and the Josiah finds the law. We missed that. I didn't get a chance to talk about that. Anything else? Any comments, questions? Yes, sir.
You know, the other thing in chapter 22 and on, Hezekiah was a great king of Judah. Josiah was a great king as well.
Yes, he was.
Right in the sight of the Lord had fallen.
It's amazing. Yes, he did. He followed David, his father, and what you find is and 2 Kings 23, it says, before him, Josiah, there was no king like him who returned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might. Does that sound familiar? All his soul, all his heart, all his might. Yes, sir.
Our hindsight's always 20/20, and we think of Hezekiah asking for more time and he got it. But those 15 years also brought Manasseh,
That's right.
who was the worst king. When they all go into exile, they talk about people who never left the sins of Manasseh.
Yep. As well said. And there's a whole lot you could talk about there. You're exactly right. You never know what would have happened. But anyway, the people had set themselves up. At the end of the story, when it comes to Judah, they had sinned so much and so hard and so often that even though there are all these reforms, it really wasn't enough in the end. And God still judges them and takes them off to Babylon. But there's a lot of good things that happen. We'll talk about 1st, 2nd Chronicles, then we'll talk about the post-exile stuff like Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Ezra, all those books, and we'll go from there.